Dorothy Jane Scott was a 32-year-old single mother of a 4-year-old boy named Sean. They lived in Stanton, California with her aunt. She worked in Anaheim as a back office secretary at Swinger's Psych Shop and Custom John's head shop while her parents, who just lived a few blocks down from her work, watched John. Every evening, Dorothy would pick her son up from her parents' home and drive the 20 minutes back to their home. She would cook dinner and then watch cartoons with Sean or read him a book. She had a normal life until the call started. For several months, Dorothy had been receiving phone calls from a man she did not know. The calls were alarming to say the least. The man threatened her and warned her that he was watching her every move. One such call could be recorded as saying, "When I get you alone, I will cut you up into bits so no one will ever find you." On one occasion, Dorothy received a phone call telling her to look outside because he had left her a gift. On the windshield of her car was a dead rose. Other calls would be to tell her he knew where she was and what she was wearing. The calls left Dorothy terrified. Dorothy once said that the voice sounded like someone she knew, but never mentioned who, and the caller never revealed who they were either. It was May 28th, 1980, and Dorothy Jane Scott was in a meeting at work. She noticed that her coworker, Conrad Bostron, looked ill and had a red mark on his arm. The mark on his arm was red and swollen, so she knew he needed medical attention. Another coworker, Pam Head, and Dorothy took Conrad to the emergency room at UCI Medical Center, where it was determined he had been bitten by a black widow spider. Pam said she and Dorothy stayed in the waiting room together. Once Conrad was discharged, Dorothy offered to bring a car around to pick him and Pam up at the door. When she still hadn't picked them up after a few minutes, they went out to the parking lot to try to find her. Suddenly, they saw Dorothy's white 1973 Toyota station wagon speeding toward them. Her headlights were on full beam, blinding them so they couldn't see who was behind the wheel. The car sped past them and took a sharp right turn out of the parking lot. A few hours later, after not hearing from Dorothy, Pam and Conrad call her parents to ask if they have seen her, but she has not shown up to pick up her son from their house yet. Her parents eventually called the police to report her missing. In the early morning hours of May 29th, just hours after her disappearance, Dorothy's car was discovered in a fire in an alley in Santa Ana. A week later, an unknown man called Vera Scott, Dorothy's mother. "Are you related to Dorothy Scott?" the caller asked. "Yes," Vera answered. "I've got her," he said before quickly hanging up. Was this the same man that was calling Dorothy before she disappeared? This man would continue to call nearly every Wednesday for the next 4 years. The calls were usually short and usually occurred when Vera was home alone. Police told Dorothy's parents to keep the details surrounding the disappearance quiet. This is so when someone is brought in, they do not know all the details from reading them in the paper. So if a suspect can tell details of the crime that only the investigators know, they're likely the one who did it. Jacob Scott, Dorothy's father, was tired of keeping quiet. He called the registered newspaper in Santa Ana, who then ran a story about Dorothy's disappearance. The same morning that the story was ran, managing editor Pat Riley received a phone call. "I killed her. I killed Dorothy Scott. She was my love. I caught her cheating with another man. She denied having someone else. I killed her." Pat Riley said that this caller knew details about Dorothy's disappearance that weren't even published in the article. One detail being that she was wearing a red scarf that night. He also knew the reason she was at the UCI Medical Center. However, in April of 1984, the man called during the evening. Jacob Scott was home and answered the phone. The call stopped after that. Dorothy's ex and Sean's father was looked into and questioned. He had an airtight alibi. He had been in Missouri at the time, and he was immediately ruled out as a suspect. Dorothy's co-workers were questioned numerous times. Since Dorothy worked in the back office, she never interacted with customers, so the chances were slim that any one of them were responsible either. Because of all the calls from the unknown man, the police planted a recording device to record what was being said, and the phones tapped to trace the calls. Conveniently, the perpetrator never stayed on the line long enough for any of the calls to be traced. On August 6, 1984, a construction worker discovered skeletal remains that were buried on Santa Ana Canyon Road. The remains first seen were from a dog, but underneath them were the charred remains of a human. Her turquoise ring and watch were also found. The bones were identified as Dorothy Jane Scott's. Dorothy's mother said the watch had stopped at 12:30 a.m. on May 29th, about an hour after Pam Head and Conrad Bostron last saw Scott's vehicle. An autopsy could not determine the cause of death, and according to police, the mysterious caller who had tormented both Dorothy and her parents is the man who killed Dorothy. After the news of the grim discovery made headlines, Jacob and Vera received one last phone call. Is Dorothy home? To this day, the man responsible for Dorothy's death has not been caught. However, friends of Dorothy and her own son believe that a man named Michael Butler is responsible for her death. As it turns out, Mike Butler passed away from health complications in 2014. A memorial featured in the online news site Orca's Issues details how Mike was a deeply religious man, well known throughout his community. Mike's family settled in Southern California after his father, who served as an Army captain for many years, retired. He was drafted into the Army in the 1960s and served his time in Germany as a writer. When his military time came to an end, he worked as a roadie for several rock bands, including the Beach Boys and his sister's all-female band, Bertha. Mike's sister, the accomplished musician, had also worked at one time at Swinger's Psych Shop, the same shop where Dorothy worked and Dorothy's father Jacob previously owned. In time, Mike settled down in Orange County, California, and took a job as a machine shop maintenance employee. Why is this of interest? In a 2016 article from nightflight.com titled Feed Your Head, Night Flight Takes a Trip Back to the Early 70s Head Shop, the author who frequented Swinger's Head Shop describes his experience with it in detail, including the location. Swingers was a 2,400 square foot store located at 517 South Brookhurst Street, about a mile south of the Santa Freeway, next door or in close proximity to an auto mechanic or body shop or muffler shop, something like that, on the corner of Orange Avenue. Could Mike Butler have worked at that auto mechanic or body shop or muffler shop that was in close proximity to Swingers? The person who stalked and harassed Dorothy prior to her kidnapping and murder was obsessed with her day-to-day activities, including what she wore. Is it possible that her murderer worked at that shop, granting him the opportunity to keep such close tabs on her? Dorothy had told several people, including her parents, that she recognized the voice on the other end of the line, but couldn't place it. Could Dorothy have, at one time, brought her car in for some repairs, leading her to come face to face with her killer? Another theory revolving around the disappearance and death of Dorothy is that she fell victim to the Golden State Killer, also known today to be Joseph James D'Angelo. Dorothy's murder also fits into a timeline of murders committed by the Golden State Killer in the Orange County area at that time. It's also interesting to note that D'Angelo also lived just 11 miles away from the UC Irvine Hospital at the time of Dorothy's disappearance. Dorothy Jane Scott was abducted from UC Irvine Hospital on May 28, 1980, and killed hours later. In 1979, Keith and Patrice Harrington worked at UC Irvine Hospital. Keith still worked there in 1980. The Harringtons were killed by the Golden State Killer just 3 months after Dorothy Jane Scott was abducted and murdered. They were killed on August 19, 1980, at their Dana Point, Orange County home. Dorothy also shared some similarities in hairstyle, facial structure, and looks to Manuela Witten, killed at her Irvine home on February 5, 1981. Witten was last seen alive February 4, 1981, at Newport Specialty Hospital, now part of Foothill Regional Medical Center. Dorothy Jane Scott was last seen alive at UC Irvine Hospital in Irvine, just 6 miles. The Golden State Killer was also known to make taunting, cruel phone calls to victims, or in this case, the victim's family. Prior to the crime, there is stalking, peeping, and phone calls, sometimes seen in other Golden State Killer cases. Leave your comments down below discussing your thoughts on the disappearance of Dorothy Jane Scott. Is Michael Butler responsible? Did she fall victim to the Golden State Killer? Or is there a whole other side yet to be discovered to solve this mystery? Please be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. See you next time.